Welcome everyone. It's encouraging that there's this number of people who are interested in questions like distributing the tax burden and what to do about tax policy in Vancouver. For those of us who work in public policy, these are interesting questions, but I know they're also of great interest to citizens. I want to address this question of the distribution of the tax burden in terms of the increase in taxes. Let me just first of all note just a summary of what was really said before. But the City of Vancouver has pretty much got to the point where they've decided on their overall expenditure envelope. They're talking about a 3.9% overall increase in expenditures. To get there, they've achieved $10 million in efficiencies through their review. There's $20 million in cuts in programs and services, and another about $12.5 million that will come from extending the hiring freeze from last year into the current year. On the whole, I think these are reasonable measures. I think there's been a relatively good job in terms of prudency. I have some problems in looking at, in terms of some of the cuts, libraries, parks and recreation. I think we can ask some questions about that, and I will come back to that because, as is always the case in budgeting, I've spent many years in government. Some years I've operated my own business. You're always looking at the interaction between the expenditure side and the revenue side, and there are trade-offs, and these trade-offs are very complicated. So, we always have to look at alternatives in terms of how we do these trade-offs. The city is looking at an increase in revenues equal to that increase in expenditures. So, balanced budget, 3.9% increase in revenue is necessary. To do that, 11% increase in utility charges. This is going to be a fairly substantial increase in costs for both business and residents, although I haven't been able to get exactly clear how this will be distributed. The garbage charges will fall disproportionately on residences. I don't know, they're at 17%, sewage 16%, water 10%, and we're still waiting for further information exactly how those will be distributed between these two groups of taxpayers that we mentioned. There'll be a 4% increase in other fees, and a 2% increase in property taxes, as they've set out. Now, the policy question, they've reduced it to this framework, and then they've said the question is, how are they going to, who's going to pay for this 4%, for this 2% increase in property taxes in order to balance the budget? And the decision, as I understand it, based on the policy that they're talking about, is that there will not be a 2% increase across the board for business and residential properties, but rather there'll be a 4% increase for residential properties and a 0% increase for business. So this is what's known as the tax shift. Now, we all recognize that virtually everybody in Vancouver is experiencing some of the uncertainties and pressures of these economic times. They're trying times. They're difficult times for everyone. They're no more difficult for homeowners than they are for business. They're no more difficult for business than they are for homeowners. There's, the burden acts differently on different people, but by classes, each are having their own difficulties. And we know our family and friends who are having difficulties with their costs. We know business friends who are having difficulty with their costs. Now here, the city's priorities come to play. The city does have a choice. Does it pursue this 4% increase for residential and 0% increase for business? Or does it, as I would advocate, pursue at this time, during these economic times, a policy of equal burden sharing? And that's very simply done. It's simply 2% increase for each of the groups, business and residential property. This is fair, and tax fairness is particularly important in economic times like this. I'll come back to these questions about principle, how to distribute the business and residential tax on a longer-term basis and the difficulties of sorting those through. Now, there are other alternatives as well. I mean, if it is the case that it is thought by the City Council that a 4% increase is a burden that the residential taxpayers can carry, you could, if you want to, see this as then fairness might say, well, 4% for them, and why not a 1% increase for business to carry the cost of these harsher library and parks and recs cuts, and that still gives you your if you want to just think that it's fair for business to have a break relative to residents at this time, you could do that. All I'm pointing out by this is there are choices. This is all about choices and about the principles you apply with respect to these choices. I want to make 3 basic points about all of this. It is a time for fiscal prudence. Politics and government should reflect the situation, conditions, and the feelings of its citizens, including business and residents. The City Council has done a fairly good job of this, I think. But there are some questions about how deep these cuts have gone and whether they need to go as deep as they have. This is not a question that can be solved by some expert or some policy wonk. This is a question of your views of values and priorities and that sort of thing. I personally put a high value, as do citizens, on our library services. I think our libraries have taken sufficient cuts already, and I would certainly have not done that within the choices. There are some of the measures within the parks and recreational services that I would also have some arguments that I would have with. So I would favor, first of all, the cuts not be as deep. Then I would look at the revenue side, and I would, so this would argue for a slightly higher increase in revenue, but it wouldn't be significant. And then I would say, okay, there are sacrifices being made. We're going to have to increase taxes. So I would say apply the principle of equal burden sharing. That's the principle we should apply at this time. That would mean something like a 2.1% increase for both, and that would be acceptable for both business and commercial. I just want to remind you, in terms of history of taxes, residential homeowners have not been getting off easy, as seems to have been suggested. In the last 5 years,